and we're starting the webinar. Hello and welcome to GPJFF in Conversation. My name is Olivia Antsis and I'm the Executive Director of the Gershman Philadelphia Jewish Film Festival. It is such a pleasure to have the filmmaking team from the Vigil here. And I'd love to thank IFC Films, IFC Midnight, and Tamar Simon from Mean Streets Management for making this program possible. Now, my job here tonight is to introduce our wonderful panel and our moderator, and then make myself disappear so the conversation can start. All of you that are here to witness this conversation, you are welcome to use the chat to post some questions that the moderator will include in his discussion in just a few minutes. So I am going to start with Keith Thomas, who is the writer-director of The Vigil. Keith, thank you so much for being here. And Keith worked in clinical research at several Western teaching hospitals before embarking on a career as a novelist and screenwriter. He has published The Clarity and Dahlia Black, both with Simon & Schuster, and developed numerous books, films, and TV projects with creators like James Patterson, and The Vigil is Keith's feature debut. Thanks again, Keith.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Amazing, amazing film.
Thank you.
And next we have, and just hold on one moment, I'm just quitting out of this because something is beeping here for me. Okay, now we have Raphael Margules. Raphael is the producer of The Vigil. Along with co-producer J.D. Lifshitz, Raphael launched Boulder Light Pictures in 2012 with the production of the body horror film Contracted in 2013, a major theatrical and VOD hit for IFC Midnight that was quickly followed by a sequel. Over the following years, Boulder Light continued to grow its production arm with a number of genre films and expanded to work alongside global leaders in the industry. Thank you so much, Raphael, for being here tonight.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, awesome. Dave Davies. He has earned over 50 credits for acting in film and television, including The Big Short, Logan, The Walking Dead, True Detective Season 1, and the true crime movie Bomb City, a film which received widespread national attention. Numerous festival awards were won, including 3 for Davis as Best Actor. He recently appeared in Tom Hanks' film Greyhound in 2020. In addition, Davis's credits include producer, writer, composer, and multi-instrumental musician. He has worked professionally in theater for a decade, graduating from Tulane University with a BFA in performance. At the age of 22, with the New Orleans Shakespeare Festival, he starred as Hamlet. And Dave Davis, of course, is the lead actor in The Vigil. Thank you so much for being here. Wonderful
My pleasure.
Performance.
Thank you.
And last we have Malky Goldman, who is another actor in the film, but also the associate producer. She's an actor and an artist currently based in New York City. She was born and raised in a Yiddish-speaking home in Jerusalem. She has previously appeared in several films and shows, including the New York Times Critics' Pick, God of Vengeance, as well as the hit Netflix series Unorthodox. Her most recent work includes a few indie films, as well as the Hasidic horror film, The Vigil. Thank you all for joining us from the filmmaking team. And today, your moderator will be Mark Leuchter, who is a professor of Hebrew Bible and Ancient Judaism and serves as director of Jewish Studies at Temple University. His work includes the study of mythology in ancient Israel and Second Temple Judaism, the phenomenon of prophecy in the ancient Near East, the formation of the Hebrew Bible, and the history of the Israelite priesthood. He has also written and lectured on anti-Semitism in the Bible and contemporary American politics and society. Mark has previously served as the coordinator of biblical studies at the University of Sydney and a visiting professor of Hebrew Bible at University of Pennsylvania. His favorite band is Rush. He always loves to include that in the bio. So I decided, what the hell, I'll let everyone know. Anyway, thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Mark, for moderating this conversation. Thanks to everybody in the audience, and I will see you all later. Enjoy.
Thank you so much, really. And I'm so glad to be here with this really amazing team of artists and strategists. I think when you make a film like this, it seems to me like you have to strategize every step of the way to make sure that you can get from point A to point B. And so a lot of the questions that I prepared really revolve around some of the ways that you, I think, envisioned how to make it through the production and how to realize this in concert with the ideas that are embedded in the story and that come out so powerfully in the images that we eventually see on screen. It looks like we're also going to have opportunities for people who are participating in the webinar to ask questions if they come up on the chat. So please go ahead and ask them. I have some prepared questions for the whole group and for everybody in the group as well. So I think I'm going to start with that, and you can determine, who, when it's a question for the whole group, you can determine who wants to go first, or I guess whoever unmutes themselves first gets to go first. But we'll also then take questions from people who are observing at home, and really looking forward to a good conversation here. So here's the stuff that I have written out first. So I'm just going to read, and this is the question. The first set of questions I have is really for the whole group. So here's the first one. The film seems really first and foremost to be an exploration of space, and not just Yaakov's spiritual or mental space, but of course the space of the Litvak home. And I think both of them are related, and I'll have another question about this later on. But for right now, this sort of exploration is really such a visual enterprise. So my question for the group is, how much of this concept was firmly in place early on in the project before you actually got to see some of the footage that you were shooting and got a sense of how it was translating visually? Was it something that you all recognized would be an important force driving the story early on, or did aspects of it become clearer as you moved forward? So whoever would like to jump in and go ahead, please go for it. Keith, thank you.
I guess I can start talking about that. So I think the space is certainly the physical space in which we were filming came in very, very early. Even my very first draft of the script, it was clear both for budgetary reasons and the fact that I was making my first feature that a contained film was going to be important. And for me, that came down to how do you maximize the space? How do you create worlds within a tight space like that? So in the very first draft of the script, really, I was trying to distinguish between rooms based on color, in the lighting in each room, knowing that it was going to be very contained. People get very bored very easily being in one space. So how do you break that space up? Once we got a little further along and once I started meeting with Zach Cooperstein, the DP, we discussed more in detail how to expand the space even further with vintage lenses. We shot the film using these Kawa lenses that have a particularly large amount of distortion on the edges. And so that became important in the anamorphic sort of look of the film to broaden out that space. Other early discussions were about building a set versus an actual house, and chose to go with an actual house, mostly because there's just something baked into the walls of a real space. And the house that we filmed in was a house that it belonged to an elderly woman who had passed away several months before, elderly Jewish woman, very Miss Litvak-like in some aspects. And when I saw this space, it's interesting. I wrote the script, had a vision in my head of what that house looked like, storyboarded the film, just going off the image in my head. And then, of course, we saw this space, and I was amazed at how closely it mirrored what was kind of in my head and in those storyboards. Certainly in terms of, if Dave is sitting here in a chair, where are the stairs? Where's the kitchen? What's the layout? And this house fit that. It was a smaller house than I envisioned, which was really only challenging because of doing setups and, laying the equipment down, but it actually added a lot for the claustrophobia. So you really, from the earliest stages, the use of space was really important in this project.
I'm just going to unmute myself. I'm glad you brought up color, because I have a question specifically for you that I'd like to come back to with respect to the use of color in the film, which I thought was really pronounced in some places, as you just noted. But I'm curious if other people on the production team had different concepts when you were reading the script, envisioning how you would explore these both internal spaces and external physical spaces. So I'd like to direct the same question to Rafi and Malky as producers. You know, from your position as people coming in and trying to figure out logistics and negotiating the sort of business of filmmaking as you were making the film, how did you conceive of this problem or this challenge?
You know, it's funny. I mean, like, just kind of jumping off what Keith said, I remember the big conversation was, like Keith said, was that, are we going to build this set, or are we going to find this location? And we saw a few locations. And I remember once we walked into this house, it was just like the clearest thing. You know, like I always like to say, like with movies, you know, things just have to fall into place, and you have to be working with good people, and somehow the end product can end up being great if all these things do fall into place. In this movie, things just fell into place. So like with the house, like we came into the house. It was like we walked in and we knew immediately this is going to be the space of where this movie takes place. And Keith, with the help of Zach Cooperstein, our DP, just took advantage of that space in the most maximum way possible. I remember, I don't really have anything more to add beyond Keith said. I'll add a little note, which is, I remember we had to deal with how are we going to show all the text messaging and phone sequences in the movie. And I remember Zach Cooperstein being so specific, our DP, about like, I'm not shooting phones, I'm not shooting screens. Like, he refused. He's against shooting phones in movies. And at first that was unusual, because I hadn't seen that done before. Usually you cut to a phone, it's kind of a boring shot, but you have to get that information across. And I remember Keith and Zach came up with the idea of everything where Dave is scrolling or texting or whatever he's doing, they're going to create a dead space in that shot where the text message would appear. So all of that stuff was planned ahead of time. And that's just an example of just how much Keith and Zach came prepared to this location to maximize it as best they can. Because like he said, like it can be boring if you just spend the whole movie in one location, but they did such a great job. I remember that one sequence, Keith, I'll never forget, I don't know why, the name of the scene, the number of the scene, which was 17A. Sequence 17A is like Dave, Yaakov, he's left in the house alone. His Litvak goes upstairs. Reb Shulam and Menashe Lustig leaves, and Dave takes off his coat. He goes to the dining room table. He hears the noise. He goes and sits back down. He hears a sound. Headlights come. A spider crawls, and all the camera's constantly catching these from different perspectives and pushing in, and it's far away. And they just did such a great job kind of maximizing the space, and we're very well prepared.
And Malky, is there anything that you wanted to add to that? I'm thinking about and I'm going to come back because I have a question for you about one particular scene involving a phone and involving your character on the phone, and that piggybacks off of what Rafi was just saying. But I would imagine that you have some similar perspective here in terms of the way that these logistics worked out.
So I was an associate producer in this film, which means it's almost like everyone prepares the plate of cake and you just walk around handing it out. So I came when all of the logistics were already there and everything was planned out. And I was just adding a little sugar, and meaning I was helping with the Yiddish. I was helping with making sure that the artwork is correct and things like that. Because I grew up Orthodox Hasidic, I grew up in this community. It was other people as well. So I was more in the consultant point of this film. So I did not have to do all this hard work, but I have to say that when I read the script, I imagined nothing but this. And then when we walked into the film, to this house, we were all like, oh my gosh, this is crazy. And I loved how you asked the question in the beginning, how we felt about this film as a script. There was a moment where in the beginning of the script, there is this big group of people that everyone, this like footsteps kind of meeting. And all of the actors at that day, this is the second day of filming, they're all looking at each other and we're all like, wow, this is amazing. This is going to be a great film. So there was this feeling to it from reading the script to being on set that this is going to be great. It just had really good, you saw this, how would you say, like, Rafi, help me out.
Foundation?
I don't know how you would define
Foundation,
it.
yeah.
Okay. Well, getting some of the insights on this level, if having watched the film and seeing the final product, to get a sense that on the second day of filming, everybody's kind of already gleeful about it, it just adds a little bit more to the experience or the memory of watching it. And I'm really appreciative of your of you sharing that story and of all the insights that you've all shared at this point. So I want to go on and ask the group one or two more questions before I have a question or two for you, Keith, specifically. So here's my second question to the group. So there are various demons lurking in this film, but the one that seems to be the most persistent is anti-Semitism. And the film makes reference to anti-Semitism spanning the entirety of the 20th century down to the present day of the actors or the characters, which I guess is our present day too, or at least it could be. So why was it important for this issue to play out against the background of a fairly insular frum religious community, and in particular the one in Borough Park? And a follow-up to that is, to what degree did your own encounters, if you had them, with anti-Semitism in different forms affect the way you wanted the story to be told? So again, this is for everybody on the production team.
I suppose I could start with just something very kind of direct. I think, first of all, the community itself and kind of the founding of the community, in some ways, how insular the community is, to me, spoke to a lot of this history of anti-Semitism and this history of trauma, right? And this inherited sort of trauma. Once that theme had kind of emerged, it was something that I could pull personally from, just having had family in the Holocaust, as well as family before the Holocaust and pogroms, and that's where some of that came from. But in terms of the modern day, in terms of like one of the kind of, for me, in terms of writing the script and coming up with the story, one of the incidents that is pronounced in the film, I actually witnessed in New York City, which was some men harassing a little Orthodox boy on the street. It didn't play out the way that it plays out in the movie, but it was disturbing enough that I remembered it. And even more disturbing, I did nothing about it when I saw it. No one on the street did. Nobody said anything. Nobody did anything. It passed very quickly. It was just one of these things. But it stuck with me. And obviously that was the sort of seed that germinated into the larger story there. But it was in some ways, it's funny in that I feel like anti-Semitism has been, obviously, it's incredibly ancient, as old as the religion itself, but it's almost ever present, and yet we don't see it or don't ignore it. And then when it actually appears, when you actually see it, like it physically on the street, it's shocking. And for myself, I found, I felt very guilty in not doing anything about it. And I suppose some ways this movie is a way of exercising some of that. I mean, there's a lot of it additional, but that in particular.
I'm glad that you mentioned that, because just as an aside, I also teach a course at Temple University called Religion and Film. And one of the films that I always teach is Ingmar Bergman's The Seventh Seal. And we talk a little bit about Bergman and how Bergman works out his own feelings on religion and trauma through film, the same way that some people might use a confessional, or the way that some people might study or pray. So it's interesting that even though you're making ostensibly what's just a horror film, it's not just a horror film. It's following in that sort of pattern of confessional filmmaking to a certain degree, which I think really does tap into collective trauma and our responses to it. So I'm curious if other folks on the production team have some similar thoughts or comments that they'd like to add.
Yeah, I grew up in the South, where unfortunately I've had to interact with anti-Semitism and racism on a number of occasions. And I remember when we started really digging into the meat of the scene that Keith was just referencing, one of the big issues I had was, how can my character, how can Yaakov stay put on the ground without someone forcibly holding him there? How can his fear paralyze him in this way? And how does that feed into his survivor guilt and into that guilt that stays with him? And, that's a very real thing that people, Keith, a lot of us have had to deal with when we see something happen and we don't do as much as we feel we could. And in a lot of ways, that's the most frightening thing of all, is not, is there evil in the world, but do I have the strength to combat it. And that really became a very informative part of who Yaakov was.
For me, I mean, when we started developing the movie, all four of my grandparents are Holocaust survivors, and my mother's mother, she had passed away when we were in the middle of development for this movie. And I remember after that moment was kind of the impetus for me internally within the production company. I was like, okay, for emotional reasons, I need to make this movie, because to me it was so much about that generational trauma that's very unique to the Jewish people. So just and you still see it today. I remember when we were getting a little closer to production, if not in production, we were seeing it all the time. It was a constant in the news about Hasidic people getting beat up on the streets of Brooklyn. Like that was happening while we were making the movie. And I feel like nobody really cares. Like nobody, like more than I didn't look up the stats prior to this call. I'm correct if I'm wrong, but I believe it abnormally large statistics, something like 50% of the hate crimes in the U.S. are directed towards Jews. And yet it doesn't really feel like it's a conversation people are having in a real way. So, you know, just the idea of putting all of those ideas and just the idea of just generational trauma and how much that is like in how much that's a part of our DNA as Jews, and exploring that through the lens of a religious horror movie, to me was just so exciting, because you'll be able to reach a much larger audience than just making a Jewish movie.
Malky, is there anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I thought that it was so brilliant to give him this community, because having left such a tight community leaves one with so much loneliness and isolation, and but also gives him this feeling that he's on his own. And I've been asked this question in the past, I think, in our panel, and we were talking about how the Hasidic community, they go in groups and they always have each other and support each other. So Yaakov would have had so many people to call at night and to be like, there is something wrong, something happening. But because he had left, he feels like he has to deal with it on his own. And also what I'm thinking about often, because I saw the movie many times, is Yaakov doesn't want to believe in anything. He doesn't want to believe in God or demons. So that itself is a struggle. And it's like, no, this is not happening. This is not happening. And then there is this whole element of mental illness, which is also, we don't know, by putting all of these elements of like being a community, having left the community, battling his own demons, we don't know what's actually happening. Meaning, if we're not there with him through the night and he calls us in the morning and he says, oh my God, what a night, none of us would believe him. So what I'm thinking is, for this movie to be so strong and believable, we needed someone that is lonely to his core, but is also so strong and is used to deal with all of his demons at all times. So I think it was just a crucial and a brilliant addition to this film, besides of thinking about the Hasidic community, just as making the story stronger.
And I just want to piggyback off of that to my next question, which you set up beautifully, because the next question is about genre and the fact that this is a horror film. And it's, you know, I remember seeing some press about this, or people were presenting the logline that this is the Jewish Exorcist. And it's, I mean, it's a horror film like The Exorcist was, but it's not a horror film like The Exorcist was. It has a very different ethos to it. And one of the things that really comes through so strongly in this film is the sense of compassion. It is this sense of a compassionate community of people who care about each other's welfare that opens the film. And in a lot of more contemporary horror films, that's not so strongly pronounced, or it's not often pronounced. And this sort of empathy that you have for the main character is oftentimes painted on, and that's not the case here. It's built from the ground up from the very beginning of the film, because we see that he's coming from a specific community that has been traumatized and is struggling, and all of them at that table are struggling. So let me get into this question of genre. The Vigil uses cinematic grammar of contemporary horror films of the last decade or so, and I think it does it very effectively, but it strikes me as also dipping into the genre of historical drama just a little bit, even as it remains a horror film at heart. So that's something I haven't encountered beyond just surface, shtick in horror films. but it's not surface here. It does seem to be something that's a little deeper. So was this something that emerged organically in post-production, where you saw the footage that you were putting together was telling a kind of meta story that was historical in orientation, or was it something that you intended from the outset to be something working sort of behind the scenes and underneath it on almost a mythological level?
No, I for me at least, it was always kind of there. It was this sort of mythic, archetypal sort of structure in terms of, I mean, it's a story about stories in a way. It's a story about leaving and coming back. And you see that it's kind of one of those things that's just repeated very, Yaakov left the community. He's brought back by Reb Shulam. He leaves the house. He's going to go back. The camera's leaving and then coming back. And it just felt like in some ways, dealing with these larger themes, like this trauma that's universal to being human, but specific in these cases to the history of the Jews in terms of pogroms and anti-Semitism and the Holocaust. The way to talk about those things, certainly in a cinematic language, involved sort of, the structure of storytelling, in that it's mythic and it kind of has that sort of resonance. I also kind of, in the conception of the mazik, the demon at the center of it, it's in the embodiment of these things. It's the embodiment of this pain. It's the embodiment of that history. At the same time, it's its own thing. It's the rabbinical demon, that I wanted it to feel as though, right, the things that Dave is going through as Yaakov, the kind of inner turmoil is the turmoil of the people, of the community, confronted with this history, and in a way that Dark Night of the Soul becomes this sort of mythic moment. At the same time, I wanted, it's a challenge to balance that all out and have it be fun too. You just want to have some people be able to just watch it and be like, hey, that part was scary, or that was cool, and I got that. And in terms of the empathy, I think it's very common in horror films. Look, horror films, part of the fun of it is, seeing someone tormented, seeing somebody, it's particularly with certain films, like you look at the body count, right? Like how many people are going to die, how'd they die. And to set those films up, if you're killing a lot of people, you kind of want them automatically to be people worth killing, and that they're bad people. So a lot of these franchises are about, like, let's get a lot of despicable people together so we can kill them in really creative ways. And that's fun. But for this, it was crucial that he was somebody that you had empathy for. It was crucial that you wanted him to see mourning when he got in that house and all the torments. To me, it kind of came from a very Jewish sort of perspective of a demon existing in this world would not be something sent from an antagonist, something that's challenging the soul of a character for its own purposes, but that it would be pushing, in this religious conception, a demon would be pushing someone to be better. So all the scares and all the turmoil and all the horribleness he's going through is really for a cathartic goal. It isn't merely just, I'm going to take and eat your soul in hell. It's much more of a, this guy, Yaakov, has gotten to the point where, he needs a crucible, and he's going to be putting one in that house. And if he doesn't come out the right way, he's going to live with it forever. This is kind of that final moment. And this is the test. Which seemed to me like, if you're going to have a Jewish demon, that's the kind of way the demon rolls. And so that sort of mythic quality kind of came with that.
And to back up what Keith's saying, I remember when we were in development, I asked Keith a question. I was like, Keith, the demon is telling him to go upstairs. I remember Dr. Kohlberg on the phone, or not Dr. Kohlberg, Sarah saying, you have to go upstairs. And I was like, okay, like, why are we helping Yaakov out? Like, that just seems a little bit counterintuitive. And Keith was like, that's the point. I remember that was the moment where I kind of realized, like, this whole thing is pushing Yaakov in that direction, obviously along with Yaakov's courage, but it is pushing him in that direction intentionally. So that was an early conversation.
It's very interesting that you're talking about this now, because if I can just tie this very briefly back to something that I research and teach, so I do the course on religion and film, but my bread and butter is in ancient Judaism and Jewish history. And one of the things that I talk about is that you wouldn't really get a Judaism if there hadn't been a Babylonian exile. And so in some ways, the crisis of the exile and the loss of the temple and the destruction of the kingdom of Judah is what pushes people towards a deeper sense of identity and commitment to history and memory. And it seems like on some kind of symbolic level, something like that is happening in the structure of the film too.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. I think it comes down to, and I mean, this is just my own personal Judaism in a sense, but for me, one of the most fascinating aspects of the faith is the whole wrestling, the whole idea of there's no blind faith in the sense that if you just believe in XYZ, it's all good. You're going to ascend to heaven and sins will be cleared. The wrestling, the journey is the destination, is I guess what I'm saying. And the wrestling with faith, the attempting to understand it, is the process by which you learn about yourself and by which you become, the person you want to be. And so that is, a big piece of when I think of Judaism, that's a big piece of it. And then that in some ways, the framework of this story and the way that this is unfolding was that sort of that idea of Yaakov wrestling with everything and dealing with it. And he hadn't been doing such a good job on the outside. He was struggling, and it took Reb Shulam, consciously or unconsciously, to take him to this house where he's going to have this encounter that is going to force him to wrestle. And so it has that sort of biblical kind of story connotations in terms of the framework, which just was perfect for a horror film too.
Yeah, I agree. And I want to pick up on the whole idea of Jacob wrestling, because of course that's very biblical. From Genesis 32, Jacob wrestles with what might be a demon and might be an angel, and then at the end of the story turns out to be some kind of angelic figure. And so we have a couple questions from the crowd, and I want to get to them in a moment. But Dave, I want to, since we're talking about Jacob as a character, I wanted to ask you a question so that we could continue discussing this a little bit further. So I came up with this, and apropos of nothing, here we go. So Yaakov is, of course, a symbolic name. And I'm biased because my bar mitzvah sedra was Vayetze. And so, that's the whole Jacob leaving home and making something of himself. And only after he has these various kinds of struggles does he come to a sense of identity and even a sense of personal fulfillment. Am I reading too much into your character's name to imagine that his biblical namesake has something to do with his journey in the film and how you dramatize that in your performance?
No, I don't think so at all. I mean, I think it completely relates to everything we're talking about. We're born through our journeys, through our struggles. The Jewish people, as you said, come out of being expelled. Yaakov becomes who he is because he is in exodus from his own community. Even this demon that has existed since the dawn of time, the demon will exist regardless. Whether or not it wants Yaakov to succeed or fail, we don't know. Maybe the demon would be just as happy if Yaakov was destroyed through this process. But because he's not destroyed, he becomes the person that he's meant to be. So I think that makes complete sense.
Okay, good. Thank you. I thought this was a good opportunity to ask you that question, but I have several more that I want to ask you. But we have people who are tuning in who have some questions also. So I'm just going to read a couple of them. We have, I think, 5. So let's take the first 2 and then we'll come back to the rest of them a little bit later. So the first question is, what was it like working with the late, great Lynn Cohen? Which I think is a question that a lot of people have on their minds right now. So anybody would like to answer that, please go right ahead.
She's a joy. She's so wonderful. She said to me a couple of times, and this will stick with me forever, the most important person in any scene is the other person in the scene. She kept looking at me going, you're the most important person in this scene. I go, no, Lynn, you're the most important person in this scene. And she just brought so much joy to a set that was, we had a lot of fun, but it was a very heavy set. We were all very aware of the gravity of the project we were working on and about trying to bring respect and authenticity to a story that's representative of real people in a lot of ways. And, she was always able to bring lightness and fun. And for that, I was very thankful.
I will say, in terms of with Lynn, the character of Miss Litvak that she's playing, the voice, the accent she's using is Lynn's own grandmother. She's pulling from her own history and kind of voicing her own grandmother through this character. And that was fascinating. I mean, she turned that on immediately. There was no, it was no kind of working at getting that. That just came right out of her. That was her own history. And in fact, the speech she gives where she talks about the pogroms, I had written that, but it was very personal to her as well. And that's where her family was from. And so she had a direct connection to that. She, you know, that was a very, that whole tefillin scene was a very emotional scene. And Lynn really brought, I mean, not only this incredible this ocean of experience that she had, but it was personal. She, even though it's this horror film, she brought this very sort of personal take to it. She really saw she understood Miss Litvak. And even though Miss Litvak was quite demented, when we're encountering her, Lynn understood who this character was, where she came from, and Lynn tied it directly into her own history, which was amazing.
Anybody else want to comment on your experience with Lynn?
Yes. I was really fortunate. I met Lynn 4 years before she passed. And in this 4 years, I got to work with her on 4 projects. And she was just so incredible, such a giving, nice human being. When she was on set, she would be so uplifting. And then the second the door closed in her room, you saw this deep something that you don't know from somewhere else. And at the when we were filming the vigil, she was so weak, she was so fragile, she had a cold and the flu and whatever you can think of. And we were thinking, and she was walking upstairs because her resting room was upstairs, and I was worried the whole time, how is she going to get through the next moment? And then the second the camera goes on, she's walking up the stairs and down the stairs, and her back is straight and her face is something different, and she was just something that you can't describe. You have to see her. And my favorite thing about her was she would say the whole time, you're only as good as the people you work with. You're only as good as the people you work with, in a way of like making everyone feel really good, and in a way to make everyone aware, hey, we're all in this together. She was brilliant and fun to work with, and it's a shame she's gone.
Thank you for that. And I think that, I mean, she was such an important part of popular culture that I think everybody participating in or watching this event probably has their own relationship with the characters that she played. And it's great to get some insight from people who work with her and got to know her personally nicely like that. So thank you so much. I want to take the next question, which I think is something that maybe Keith or Rafi could answer. It's when you envisioned and developed the film, was the outcome close to the original vision? You mentioned the location, but what about character representation and choices that the actors made?
Yeah, I mean, I would say it was very close to what I envisioned. The script obviously went through changes, as all scripts do. The original script that I had written was not set in Brooklyn, for example, but that was when I teamed up with Rafi and JD. That was something they were like, if we're making a Jewish horror film, we're making the Jewish horror film, and it's going to be in Brooklyn. So, we changed that up, and that obviously switched things. But it felt to me, so it's interesting. So I had an idea of exactly who these characters are and what they look like and what they're acting like and the lives they're living and what's going on in their heads as I'm trying to figure out the story and their dialogue. But it's when you start casting and when you start meeting folks that it really comes to life. And then once they're in the role and then once they're going, then you're having that kind of conversation. At the same time, I had heard before that casting is really, so much of it is gut instinct and gut feeling. And that couldn't have been more true in this case. I think with both Malky and Dave, it was a gut thing that you just know when you know. And, for example, Dave, and Dave's heard this story millions of times, but I don't think it ever gets old. But, you know, I was looking for my Yaakov, and I had a lot of amazing options. But I wasn't finding the one person that my gut told me this is the guy. And it's tough because I had lived in Yaakov for so long writing the script, and of course put myself in that chair and put myself in that house. And so I was looking for somebody that I felt would be able to kind of to embody that. Anyway, interviewed a lot of folks, done a ton of casting, had found a lot of amazing people, and just wasn't feeling exactly what I needed to feel. And so I took a break. And I was just watching TV, and I happened to see the movie Bomb City, in which Dave Davis has a 3-foot green mohawk, and he's playing a punk rocker in 1980s Texas. But I could tell 2 things. Number one, my Judar went off. I knew that was a Jew. I could tell immediately that guy's Jewish. And number 2, he was able to embody the sort of emotional performance and language without saying much in this role. I mean, the punk rocker guy, he had lots of things to say. He's playing with a puppy. He's doing all sorts of stuff. He's fighting with people in the street. But I could tell just the way he's wearing his face. That sounds weird to say, but the way he was wearing his face told me that if I put that guy in a chair and put the camera on him, he's going to be able to give us the Yaakov. So I told Rafi, I was like, look at this guy's performance. That's what I need. And so Rafi said, well, why don't you contact him? And, you know, the stars aligned. And amazingly, Dave liked the script, and I was right. He was Jewish, and, you know, everything kind of worked out. But that taught me this gut thing. It was that gut feeling. And then, you know, once everyone was assembled, they all kind of brought even more to the script. There wasn't much improv going on outside of the Yiddish stuff to a certain extent, but I felt like they were able to take the dialogue I'd written and just imbue it with something a little more. Even tiny little tweaks in terms of the delivery gave it a richness that I could have only hoped for when I wrote it.
I'd actually like to ask both Dave and Malky questions that develop what you were just saying or relate to what you were just saying, and especially in terms of dialogue and performance. So the first question, I guess, would be for Dave. I had it written down before, but it works very nicely in dovetails with what Keith was just saying. So there are moments in the film where Yaakov is really barely holding on, and to his sanity and his exhaustion and the experience, it weighs so heavily upon him and his ability to speak and to talk. And I'm sure the demands of a shooting schedule left you pretty exhausted as well, but the anxiety and the dread that Yaakov conveys really manifests in the way he uses language, especially when he slips in and out of English and Yiddish. So when you prepared for the role, did you think about the way that these language issues could be used to communicate Yaakov's identity struggle that he has throughout the film?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the most important things for me in developing this character was feeling like at no point was I doing an imitation. I didn't want to just parrot something I had heard before. And the only other option is to try to really build a character from the bottom up. And in order to do that, I needed to meet people whose life experiences were representative of Yaakov's life experiences. And I needed to understand, among many other things, what is Yaakov's relationship with speech? What did his family sound like growing up? What did his friends sound like? What did the things he listened to sound like? Did he have any exposure to pop culture? Was it all exclusively music within the community? When was the first time Yaakov heard a commercial? When was the first time Yaakov truly understood a billboard even, And so that would influence the way that he sounds based on different people that he's speaking to and from one scene to another. And that really informs his desire to be accepted as well and to form this new life. How deep in that process is he when we meet him? How much does he care when meeting his new crush? Does he care about trying to sound more secular American? Is Yaakov actually doing an imitation? How much of himself is he hiding? So those were all things that we talked about and worked on. And, you know, Malky was a trooper, letting me call her at all hours of the day and night. And, you know, hey, Malky, I was thinking about stubbing my toe in this scene. Can you give me 10 different ways to say ouch? You know, and okay, hold on, I'll call some people. And Malky would pull the brain trust together. And okay, here we have some options. And then I would practice those so I could have them in my back pocket if I needed them. But also so that when we actually got into the performance, when we got into addressing the real things that we're trying to do with this film, that I didn't have to think about those things anymore. And the language could become second nature, so that it was become second nature for Yaakov to stress about, oh my gosh, is my dialect too thick right now? Or now that I'm talking to the rabbi, am I going to put it on a little more? There's even one scene where I don't remember quite what it was, Keith, maybe you do, but we respond to the Rebbe in English, I believe, almost as like, yeah, I get it, man. Leave. I get what my job is. You can go now. And so it was like,
Yeah,
I've
at the
been
end,
speaking. Yeah, I've been speaking to him in Yiddish, and then it was like, look, I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna do American English now. This is who I'm trying to be at the moment. Please respect it. So, you know, within that dialect and within that language study, there was definitely a lot of Yaakov's character coming out.
Thank you. I really think that the way that these characters speak, and not just Yaakov, but all the characters in the film, speech and cadence of speech is such an important way of communicating their tentativeness in taking any kind of step forward, or for that matter, taking a step backward too. So I want to ask Malky a question now, which is related to this and to her performance too. So I had this written out, and this is a question that I really been thinking about a lot. So there's a pivotal scene where Sarah and Yaakov are video chatting over their phones, and Sarah morphs in that moment into an iteration of the demon, and it's completely terrifying. But it's not, there's no special effects. It's just, she turns on a dime, and solely through the performance, you suddenly realize this isn't Sarah, this is the demon, you know, who's inhabiting the technology that is conveying Sarah's face to Yaakov right now. So it's really an arresting moment. It's totally terrifying because we first encounter her and she's very vulnerable, and she's also very supportive earlier in the film. So can you talk about how you filmed that sequence and the way maybe that the earlier story beat affected how you approached your performance?
Yes, of course. So first of all, Keith was right there. I'm just saying. But it was really, really cool. I want to say something about Dave's Yiddish. It was really, really, really cool how in the beginning, the first scene where she's asking him, do you want coffee? And then out of nowhere, Dave is like, I don't like coffee, which is actually something that so many ex-Hasidic men do. And then I'm like, okay, hot chocolate. I just want to go out. And that moment just came out. And it was really feeling like, okay, this kid is just, he's just not getting it. Really gotta, you know, help him. And also he's so cute. But for the later part, it was actually, it was really interesting because we are in this little room with a nice headboard and no mattress, but a really comfortable blanket. And the demon is right behind me. So we're both squeezed into a small spot, and the cinematographer is holding the phone, a cell phone with us, because we're recording on the cell phone. So we're moving together and everything is just so tight. And the speech from Yaakov comes out from a different phone. So he's not there. I'm not even talking to him. So suddenly everything starts becoming a little bit trippy. And it really truly happened where he calls, I hear his voice and I want to help him. And then suddenly I'm like, he's so helpless. And then this like little demon next to me that is physically right there just got me so excited. And I just wanted to rip him apart. And I don't know what happened, but it was just this feeling. And I was like, I will get him. I will get him. And then Keith said, we had like 2 takes, and then Rafi said he wanted another take with Yiddish, and Keith says, I got this. And usually actors, I mean, I'll speak for myself, I'm insecure. I'm like, we only did so little. And Keith says, we got this. And I'm like, yeah, I know. I don't know what happened. It just, the room was full of demons and I don't know.
It worked so well. And it was, I think for me, it was the most terrifying moment in the film. And there's a lot of good scares in this movie, but that one gave me some chills, and I'm sure I'm not the only one.
I'd love to hear that. Keith, did you hear that? Rafi, you hear that?
Loud and clear.
All right, so I'm getting some questions from folks in the audience. So the next question is from Brian Rudnick. He's got a couple questions here, but I want to go with the one that I think might actually be really relevant to the actual plot and theme of the film. And Brian wants to know if the film is at all inspired by or sort of functioning as an intertext to the classic Yiddish golem movie called Der Dybbuk, or is the classic Yiddish film Der Dybbuk, or other Yiddish golem movies. So if you have any comments on that, I'd love to hear them. Yeah,
I think, when I kind of came, when I decided that I was going to make a Jewish horror film, and in my mind, I hadn't seen one that felt truly Jewish. I kind of did a survey of what was out there, what existed. And of course, I'd seen a fair number of them. There are a number of Dybbuk movies in modern times, last 10, 15 years, that involve a non-Jewish family, stumbling across a Dybbuk box at a yard sale, and then, oh no, the Dybbuk's loose. That sort of thing, but that didn't feel truly Jewish to me. There's a Polish film called Demon that involves a Dybbuk that it's very good, but again is dealing more with Polish kind of war trauma than it is exactly dealing with kind of Jewish themes. And then there are the old, the movies from the early 1900s involving golems and Dybbuks. I was aware of these, and I was aware of stories of Dybbuks and this sort of thing, but for the Vigil, I knew it was going to have that influence. There's a Russian film from the 60s called The V, which or just V, which is another influence. It's about a guy watching essentially with a body of a witch that involves a lot of kind of supernatural hijinks. Very different in tone, but this is a common sort of theme, this kind of encounter with the supernatural, in particular in Jewish stories and stuff. So I knew that framework was going to be there, and those reference points were going to exist. I felt like Dybbuks were played out, and golems were very difficult for this sort of story. So, I kind of did a deep dive in terms of finding the Mazik. And I, weirdly enough, just like finding Dave or coming across Dave's work, I had another kind of serendipitous encounter where I met a Canadian rabbi who happened to have studied demonology, Jewish demonology. And it was through him that I really kind of dug into the concept of the Mazik and tried to create something that felt different enough to me. So it had a lot of the sort of tropes of kind of what Jewish horror might be in stories like Dybbuks, but was different. Dybbuk's an evil ghost. Golem's a man made of clay. Mazik is a demon, a true demon, born between the days of creation, that has this different backstory and this sort of thing. So there were definitely influences, both Jewish and non, but it felt like a unique opportunity to kind of dig into something that I don't think we'd seen before. Obviously with some familiarity in terms of how the evil operates, but something that by name was different.
Thank you very much. And I think the distinction between various types of demons in Jewish demonology is really significant, and it's also just endlessly fascinating. The next question comes from Herb Slifkin, and Herb writes, Mazel tov to all. This is a great film, scary, brilliantly acted and directed, and quite compelling. I wanted to ask Keith, I had read, based on your sublime work here, you may be directing a big budget version of Stephen King's Firestarter. I was wondering if you had any reservations about giving up independence to work on a bigger budget or studio, and also to all, what films have had the biggest impact on you growing up? Thank you.
So yeah, I could talk just a little bit about Firestarter. Firestarter is an interesting project in that, yes, it's a studio film, but it is treated in some ways as an independent. So the kind of the move from one to the other doesn't feel that different, honestly. There's more wiggle room maybe in Firestarter than you might expect in a studio film like that. That has to do with budget. It also has to do, kind of with the Blumhouse model of how these things come together. So it doesn't feel like that big a shift for me in terms of how it's, coming together and kind of how we're dealing with all that, navigating that. In terms of films, I'll throw two out there in terms of influence for me. Number one would be Alien. I saw it as a kid. It just left a huge impression on me for lots of different reasons, but primarily just visually. It was the one movie that was both super scary and just, I wanted to live in that world. I wanted to be on that ship. Even if it meant having something burst out of my chest. And then another film that I think that's always resonated with me that I saw as a kid, that is very influential on the Vigil, is a film called Jacob's Ladder, that was from the 90s. That was a very grounded way of showing angels and demons in a way that I hadn't seen before, that felt very material and very physical. And so that had a huge influence on kind of how the Vigil came about and the look and feel of the Vigil.
Thank you. Yep. Rafi, please go ahead.
Oh, sure. So yeah, I grew up I came in the 90s. So I very much grew up with the Tim Burton Batman movies and all of the early Jim Carrey movies. And then eventually at very early an age, I was seeing the movies like Saw and Hostel and Hills Have Eyes and Descent in theaters. And then obviously I was able to go back and to watch movies like Rosemary's Baby and The Shining and Silence of the Lambs. And I would say Charlie Kaufman's adaptation is my favorite movie of all time. And then in terms of, as a producer, my influences on the Vigil were very much The Exorcist. And then as a more contemporary example of what we were trying to achieve is The Babadook, which is another IFC Midnight title.
Yeah, there's definitely a sort of a gothic dimension to both films in terms of the overall sort of visual style, and I can see why you'd see that connection there and why it would be an interesting. It's also a wonderful film, so I'm glad that you brought that up. Also, I noticed the influence from Ridley Scott's Alien a couple times. Watching your film with the monster comes out like that, just wonderful shot. Anybody else want to share films that were influential for them as they came to the project, maybe floating in the back of your mind?
Well, I think my biggest intro to film as a kid was my dad. He loves movies. So he would introduce me to all these old actors who would go and, James Cagney, for example, who could be a gangster in one scene and be tap dancing in another. And that really turned me on to this idea that, wait, actors are these people who can do and be anything. And that's really kind of driven me in my career, is like, I want to be able to play and attempt anything. And so coming to the Vigil, I knew this was going to be a big challenge. And that was part of what was so exciting about it. Not only did Keith have great answers to all of my questions, like, why this story? Why now? Why is this important? But then I loved the script, and then, add the challenge on top of that. And I knew, I had to do this, and it really embodies the reason why I'm an actor.
Thank you. Also, James Cagney apparently was fluent in Yiddish, so I'm told, because he grew up in a Jewish neighborhood in New York. Let's take another question from our observers who are watching. This one's from Kristen Evans. Why do you think horror is an overlooked genre in Jewish film? Because we need more of them. So anybody want to tackle that one?
Yeah, I mean, I can start with it a little bit. I think Rafi's got ideas on this too. It's interesting because a lot of great horror filmmakers are Jewish. So it's funny that there aren't a lot of Jewish horror films. I think part of it has to do with a lot of mainstream kind of secular, or a lot of Jews are not superstitious, or at least don't perceive Judaism as a superstitious faith. And maybe so that has a certain part in it. Also, we don't have the bestiary that Christianity does of all these sorts of monsters. As a kid, I used to love reading through books on demons, Christian demons, where you'd have like a demon who's like the 14th prince of hell who commands the 52 armies and has all these dukes, and like that's amazing stuff. Jews don't have that. We don't have that. We got a Dybbuk here, we got a Mazik there, we got a Golem. There's just not as much. But one thing that in Rafi and I have talked about this before, actually before, was it before? It's somewhere in the creation of the Vigil, I had a concept for a Lilith movie, which, that seemed to me an overlooked sort of Jewish entity and a great way into Jewish horror. Not the succubus Lilith that you see in, a lot of late night cable movies, that the kind of, in the 90s there were like a ton of Lilith movies where it was just a chance to show some nudity and do that sort of thing. But there's Lilith theme, they're plural. There are a lot of Liliths and they're different types of demons. And so I thought that's an interesting way in. So, our hope is, and Rafi can talk about this, but our hope is, we could make, a cottage industry out of this, out of Jewish horror.
Yeah, you'd think that you would see more Jewish horror, but I obviously Christianity, like he said, there's a lot more to pull from. It's a lot scarier. But so many of the best horror movies are directed by Jewish directors. You have Friedkin with The Exorcist and Polanski with Rosemary's Baby, and there's an obvious one that I'm missing. And then more recently you have Ari Aster with movies like Hereditary. And like when I see there's so many things written also about like The Shining and Hereditary being like movies like about the Holocaust, and like I do feel like a lot of Jewish feelings through a lot of these movies, even though they're not explicitly Jewish movies. But yes, hopefully the Vigil will change that. And I know Keith and I have a career-long ambitious goal of making more Jewish horror movies in different subcultures of Jewish communities, and so hopefully we'll get to do that one day.
And I'll just note that there's actually a huge area in my field of studying ancient Jewish demonology, and there's a ton of it. It didn't make it past the Second Temple period that much, but during the Second Temple period, there's demons all over the place. So you have a lot of material to dig through there, and I would go see those movies any day of the week and twice on Sunday. So let's take another question from the group. Oh, so somebody asks, are you familiar with All Who Go Do Not Return by Shulam Dean, a former Skiver Hasid, which I'm partly through. So this is from Brian, who's currently reading the book. And I'm just wondering if anybody had any kind of reaction to Shulam Dean's work and life, and maybe how it relates to the way that you're telling the story of these Hasidim. So Malky, did you want to say something?
Yeah, Shulam is such a good friend of mine. He lives 5 minutes away from me. What I love about Shulam's book, and that is also actually so connected to this film, is it is just an honest story about one's journey, rather than painting a whole picture about other people's lives. And it's just particularly the good and the bad of whatever it takes to go from point A to point B. And I do think it's the greatest book of all the off the derech, as they call us, the best book written, the most honest. Yeah.
Thank you. Rafi, did you want to say something too?
Oh no, no.
Okay, you're just going like that. Okay, solidarity. All right, so I guess we'll end then with one final question that I have for the whole group, and I'd like to put it really to everybody to chime in as you see fit. I want to come back to something that I asked really at the outset of our session here, and that is that the film is about Yaakov's spiritual and mental space, which has obviously been affected by the trauma of the anti-Semitic attack. But more subtly, the film's opening scenes make clear that growing up in the Haredi world is itself potentially traumatic for those who find cause to step away from it. So I'm going to put this as plainly as I can. Could this story have worked with Jewish characters, say, in the Upper West Side, who send their kids to Ramaz, or who go to the Jewish Theological Seminary, for graduate school, as opposed to a Haredi community? In other words, did it have to be in a Haredi community for this kind of horror to really work? Or did Yaakov and the people in his orbit, is the monster that he encounters something that must come out of the experience of leaving a Haredi world? Or is it the kind of monster that any Jew growing up in an American environment where the threat of non-Jewish life is constantly surrounding you? Sometimes it's a threat and sometimes it's not. Would the story have worked in that kind of environment as well?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. As I said before, the earliest draft of this wasn't set in Brooklyn, but it was set within the ultra-Orthodox community. It's just not there. And it involved going to the home of somebody who was in the community. So it is kind of tied together in my mind. Obviously, when it was moved to Brooklyn, that it made even more sense. I suppose at some level, kind of some unconscious level, it felt like early on that if there's going to be a demon, it's going to be in a, ultra Orthodox home. And at the same time, because I saw the kind of community response in a way as a response to the Holocaust and the demon latching onto Mr. Litvak during the Holocaust, that it made sense in a lot of ways logistically that it ended up there. I think in some ways you kind of have to have a very deep reservoir of belief and ritual to pull from for something like this to feed upon. If you were to like get into the mechanics of the demon, but I don't think it would work in the Upper West Side. It just wouldn't.
But
it wouldn't
Keith,
resonate.
I'll play Mozik's advocate for a second.
Yeah.
Because in doing this film, I discovered that had my great grandparents had a bit of a different approach to Americanization, I could have easily been a part of this community. And I think everyone struggles with especially in the Jewish community, the larger Jewish community, we all struggle with this giant communal trauma, and everyone has to sort of battle with their own faith. And Keith, I think it's so beautiful what you said before about Judaism being in that struggle. And we all have to find our understanding of faith as it pertains to ourselves through the lens of our parents, through the lens of our communities. And, someone asked me recently, would I be a Shomer? So I think, of course, this story, it necessitates that, but I could also easily see a character that goes on a similar journey to Yaakov's, who maybe, doesn't have this relationship to Judaism, maybe is a non-practicing Jew, who somebody says, hey, would you mind watching a body for a night? Well, I'm not going to watch a body. Well, what about for 500 shekels? Okay, well, maybe I'll think about it. So, I think there are some universal things going on that could make it work in a different way as well, or could have. I don't think it'd be as good. I think you made the right choice.
I think it was really crucial to be in the community because if it was on the Upper West Side, why wasn't the body in the freezer? And B, it gave so much opportunity for ritual that you don't have to explain. Because once a broader audience sees an orthodoxy of some sort, they trust that this is a ritual that these Orthodox people do, and then you don't have to go out of your way and explain. So that's a big element. And it's much more dramatic, and it's theatrical, but I do think that there is something about the closeness of the community, of that everything just makes more sense. The story would have had to go differently for us to be so with it, and because the religiosity of it is so far from any secular audience, it gives us so much space to relate in the universal parts of the story, of the struggle, of the loneliness, of the everything else. So I think it was crucial.
All right, I want to change my answer.
Come on,
I
viva la
would venture to
difference.
say, just really quickly, I would venture to say it's a little bit different. It's been very exciting, not shocking necessarily, but exciting to see the kind of universal relatability of the movie. So like there's been a lot of secular Jews that I know and a lot of non-Jewish people that I know who have responded emotionally to the movie. The catharsis of it, the journey of Yaakov. So I'm going to take that information and kind of just apply it to this. Where like I think that it actually could have worked with a character not from that community, but I think it would have been a different movie. But I think that the more important element is that wherever that character is, whether they live on the Upper West Side or in Australia, they would need to be pulled into that community, right? So it's like, I think the character could actually be from anywhere. And now I don't know how narratively it would necessarily make sense, but we have to take that character and plop that character into this movie. It obviously would have been different, but I think that like, you have to pull them into the spitz, if you will.
I'm changing my answer again.
These are all really great, and I personally I'm very grateful for the opportunity to talk about this with you all. It's given me a much deeper appreciation for the tremendous hard work and the great payoff that came out the other side with this film. So I want to thank you for the time that you took to talk with me and everybody else who participated and asked questions. And at this point, I'm going to turn this back over to Olivia. So Olivia, please go right ahead and take it away. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Mark.
Thanks so much, everyone. I'm sure I'm echoing the audience right now. That was really a fascinating, charming conversation to listen to, and I learned a lot. So thank you all for joining us again. And I just want to end the evening with Rafi, our producer, letting us know, how do we see this film after GPJFF is done screening it through Sunday? How can your friends see it? How can family see it? Take it away, Rafi.
For sure. So here's my shameless producer plug. Yeah, the VIGIL comes out in the US, which is actually one of the last territories to be releasing the film because of pandemic reasons. And it's being released in a week from this Friday, February 22nd, which is also the Jewish holiday of Purim, which is somewhat coincidental. And it's available on all video on demand platforms. That's iTunes and Amazon, Google Play and Vudu, and anywhere that you're at home and you want to watch a movie, it will be there. It is available. Tell everybody you know, tell your Jewish friends, tell your horror friends. It's also going to be in some select theaters where safe, and you could look that up on Fandango or whatever. I know in the Miami area, it's playing at a ton of theaters. So it's in select theaters and on demand everywhere next Friday.
Okay,
Courtesy of IFC Midnight.
Thank you so much, everyone. And for all you out there, please share on your social media with friends, family, emails, everything, word of mouth, everything helps. Get this movie seen. Thank you all for joining us tonight, and have a good weekend.
Thanks, y'all. Great seeing y'all.
Thank you.